Good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me on this lovely sunny day. I'm Jill Perkins and I'm the Chief Executive of the Bumblebee Conservation Trust. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Bumblebee Trust and then about Welsh Landscapes for Rare Bumblebees. The Bumblebee Conservation Trust was established in 2006 to address the decline in the UK's bumblebee populations. Our focus is to stop the extinction of the very rarest bumblebees and to create a long-term sustainable future for all bumblebee species. We are the only organisation in the UK solely dedicated to reversing the decline of our native bumblebees. Our vision is a world where bumblebees are thriving and valued. With its diverse range of landscapes and natural habitats, Wales supports some of the UK's most important populations of threatened bumblebee species. 5 species are listed, at least 22 of the UK's 24 bumblebees call Wales home, almost 10% of the world's species. 5 species are listed by the Welsh Government as species of principal importance for conservation. These are the shrill carder, brown-banded carder, moss carder, red-shanked carder and Rudra bumblebees. Additionally, the Bilbrey and broken-belted bumblebees are scarce enough that we are concerned about their future across the UK. This is exacerbated by the fact that these 2 species live in remote areas well away from bumblebee surveyors. The richness and diversity of these bumblebee communities in Wales is unique. These species co-occur across different landscapes in Wales and their ranges and habitat preferences overlap. The Welsh Landscapes for Rare Bumblebees projects aim to untangle this complex picture and set out to review the existing data and assess what we know for each species. Where in Wales do they live? Where are the hotspots and where are the not spots where no one has looked for them recently? Which habitats do they preferentially occur in? And where are future surveys and conservation work best focused to maximise the benefits? We would like to thank everyone who has recorded bumblebees in Wales over the years and all the LRC Wales staff who have dug out the data and delivered the mapping work and report for this project. Together, they have pulled out all the stops to deliver some really interesting and useful resources and information, which we hope will make a big difference for bumblebees in Wales. Ultimately, this project provides a roadmap for future survey work, including our ongoing Skills for Bees project, for decision-making which benefits bumblebees and hopefully more conservation work benefiting bumblebees across Wales. We look forward to sharing these findings with you and hopefully this will be a springboard for more conversations with some of you and your colleagues in future. Sinead Lynch, our Conservation Manager, will now provide an overview of the rare bumblebee species in Wales.
So I'm Sinead, I'm the Conservation Manager for Bumblebee Conservation Trust. Thank you so much for joining this webinar today to find out about the Welsh Landscapes for Rare Bumblebees project. The webinar is going to run for about an hour and a half, so till 12 p.m. I'm going to give you an introduction to the project and the species that we're focusing on. Then I'm going to hand over to Adam and his colleagues from Lurk Wales who are contracted to undertake the work on behalf of BBCT, and they're going to run through the findings. The project was funded by Welsh Government's Green Recovery Fund. There will be some time for questions at the end of the webinar, so please do put your questions in the Q&A box. Your mics and cameras are disabled. The webinar is also being recorded and it will be made available on our YouTube channel. So as Jill said, there's 24 species of bumblebee in the UK, and at least 22 of them are found in Wales. And with our diverse range of landscapes and habitats, Wales supports some of the UK's most threatened bumblebee species. And these species kind of co-occur and sort of overlap across different landscapes. So the Welsh Landscapes for Rare Bumblebees project aim to untangle this quite complex picture and set out to review existing data, find out which habitats they occur in, which landscapes in Wales are hotspots for rare bumblebees, and where there are potential gaps in data. So as Jill said, listed under Section 7 of the Environment Wales Act 2016 are 5 bumblebee species of principal importance, and these include shrill cardabee, brown-banded cardabee, moss cardabee, red-shank cardabee, and Rudra bumblebee. And in addition, we're looking at Bilbrey bumblebee and broken-belted bumblebee, which aren't currently listed on Section 7, but we would consider these species to be potentially scarce or threatened. So we're looking at about a third of bumblebee species in Wales as being rare or scarce or potentially threatened. So I'm going to run through these 7 species. It's very much a whistle-stop tour. I'm going to be focusing more on kind of species ecology, not on the identification, which is that's a whole different webinar, and not too much on the distribution because lurk whales are going to be going through that in the rest of the webinar. So we'll start with shrill cardabee. Oh, sorry, let me just go back. So aside from the overlaps in sort of distribution and habitat preference, which I've mentioned, and you'll see in the maps coming up, there are other similarities between these species. So most of them are kind of later emerging, all of them emerge sort of later on. Some are sort of emerging April time, but some maybe not till May or June. And they'll continue nesting into August and some well into September. So that's something a lot of these species have in common. Most of these species have long tongues, not all of these species, but many of them do, and they're particularly found foraging on flowers with long flower tubes. So, you know, species like legume species, dead nettles, woundworts, yellow rattle, and particularly species of open kind of grassland habitat. They're all associated, and you'll hear me say this a few times, they're all associated with landscapes with extensive and connected flower-rich habitat. So the presence of these species probably is indicative of a level of connectedness of flower-rich habitat within a landscape. And conversely, agricultural intensification is likely to be a key factor in the declines of most of these species. But these declines are kind of compounded by various other interacting threats, such as climate change. All 4 of the rare carder bumblebees nest above ground in tall grassland, and they generally have a smaller than average colony size, and at least in the case of shrill cardabee, probably relatively short distance foraging trips, which makes them quite vulnerable to habitat fragmentation. And also 5 of these species, so with the exception of shrill cardabee and Bilbrey bumblebee, are quite tricky to identify, so that may be contributing to under-recording as well. So I'm going to run through the species. So I'm going to start off with shrill cardabee, a Section 7 species, probably the UK's most endangered bumblebee species. People in Scotland may argue it's the great yellow bumblebee, but with just 5 populations, 2 in England, 3 in Wales, it's certainly very threatened. And obviously Wales has a massive role to play in helping to conserve this species. Last year we published the Shrill Cardabee Conservation Strategy. That was led by Bumblebee Conservation Trust with BugLife, RSPB, Natural Resources Wales, Natural England and Bee Wars. So please do have a look at that, and with that came a knowledge review as well. So there's lots of information about this species. It's associated with quite a range of lowland habitats. And a lot of people see it foraging on species like red bartzia, but also legumes like tufted vetch and meadow vetchling, and also species like white dead nettle, woundworts, and also sort of yellow composites. In my experience, in Wales, they tend to do well on scruffy sites, so sites with a mosaic of open sward and scrub, hence they do quite well on brownfield sites in sort of Newport, Cardiff, Port Talbot, and those sorts of areas. But they're also associated with extensive flower-rich sites such as parts of the Grunt Levels, Kenvig, Castlemartin range. Okay, so on to Bombus humulus, which is also a Section 7 species. Very similar kind of habitat preferences to shrill cardabee, but perhaps a more extensive sort of range in Wales. Again, found in landscapes with extensive connective flower-rich habitat. So Rudra bumblebee, also a Section 7 species, found in lowland areas in England and Wales, and also on Coll and Tiree in Scotland. It's associated with landscapes, as I say, of with an extensive network of connective flower-rich habitat. It seems to be found on kind of chalk grasslands and neutral grasslands, and also brownfield sites and coastal habitats. And it seems to kind of like small flowered legumes like melilot, and also sort of harebell, knapweeds, scabiouses. It's probably under-recorded because of the similarity with the red-tailed bumblebee, but there are signs of severe declines of this species. So moss cardabee, another Section 7 species, and also IUCN vulnerable. It's a fairly coastal species at least in the south of Britain, and perhaps more frequent in north and westerly areas. It's associated with perhaps wetter sites. I find it on sort of sand dune sites and surrounding grassland in Wales. It seems to quite like kind of dune slacks with Viper's bugloss and watermint. And so those sorts of sites in the south, southwest and northwest coastline of Wales would be good to look for this species. Because of that association with wet habitats, it's possibly impacted by climate change and very difficult to identify, so perhaps that's contributing to under-recording. Then we have the Rudra bumblebee, another Section 7 species, probably under-recorded in Wales, and perhaps has never been that common in Wales anyway. It's one of Britain's largest bumblebee species with a very long tongue and a very long face to go with it, and it's late emerging as well. Again, associated with open flower-rich habitats, but also kind of river valleys where you get sort of kind of wooded or kind of glades and rides along river valleys with sort of species like red campion and honeysuckle, and also in England associated with pollen and nectar margins, so that those kind of legume-rich and particularly red clover-rich pollen and nectar margins seem to have really benefited this species. I recorded it in near Shrewsbury a few years ago on a kind of river valley. So the Welsh Marches might be an area worth exploring for this species. On to Bilbrey bumblebee. This is not a Section 7 species, and it's still relatively widespread in Wales, but it is localised and possibly declining. It's more of a north and westerly species in Britain, very much associated with upland habitats like moorland and heathland, and also upland grassland and woodland. In Wales, also the sort of free habitats of the valleys are worth looking at. I know Liam from Buglife has done a lot of work and found them on kind of coal spore sites in the valleys. And I know there have been recent finds in the Preselies in Pembrokeshire, and you find it across sort of across upland areas and you know, sort of Snowdonia. It's potentially a species at risk in future from climate change, but Wales could be a real stronghold in Britain for this species, and it's probably pollinating a lot of our bilberries, so that's got to be a great reason to conserve this species. And I suspect it could benefit from more kind of mixed and kind of cattle grazing in the upland to try and open up and increase flowery sort of habitat in the upland. Last species is broken belted bumblebee, Bombus soroensis, also not currently Section 7, but severe signs of decline of this species. It does like to, it is a very late species. It can often be found foraging on Devil's Bit scabious, so maybe some of the marsh fritillary habitat might be worth looking at. In Wales, there's records, relatively recent records at Castlemartin Range, and unsuccessful searches at sites like Dowrog Common in Pembrokeshire. It's very much associated with kind of moorland and heathland habitat, but also kind of calcareous grassland. And again, as with all of these species, needs extensive areas of open flower-rich habitat. So just to kind of wrap up, the project started with a big push for records of all these species from the recording community in Wales, and then Lurk Wales compiled distribution maps of the 7 species, and the data was then used along with habitat data to undertake an analysis of important landscapes for rare bumblebees in Wales. So Lurk Wales will go through those findings shortly. And ultimately, this project provides a roadmap for targeting our work for rare bumblebees in future. So this includes targeting survey work, improving data and information available for decision makers, raising the profile of rare bumblebees in Wales, and hopefully informing more conservation work benefiting bumblebees across Wales. And so don't forget to put any questions you have in the Q&A box. We'll try and answer them as we go along and come to those at the end. And I'm now going to hand over to Adam, who's the manager for South East Wales Biodiversity Record Centre, who's been leading on the project on behalf of Lurk Wales.
Thanks very much, Sinead. Just give me a second while I try to share the correct screen. There. Hopefully you can all see that. So yes, this has been a really lovely little project that we've been involved in here, working with Bumblebee Conservation Trust. Local Environmental Record Centres Wales is the consortium of the 4 individual LERCs in Wales, and staff from across all 4 record centres have been heavily involved in this project. I think 15 staff have been involved in total. And today, 3 of us are presenting the findings to you. That's myself, Adam, I'm the manager of South East Wales Biodiversity Record Centre, Yusuf Samari from West Wales Biodiversity Information Centre, and Bradley Welch from Biodiversity Information Service for Powys and Brecon Beacons National Park. So there's the little graphic showing the locations of the 4 record centres. Hopefully a lot of you will know us very well. If you don't, please look us up and get in touch, because we hold an awful lot of useful information on biodiversity and help you with your particular species interests or land management interests. We're also we're unique in being the only complete network of record centres in the UK, local record centres, and also in having this 5th consortium organisation as a separate entity, Local Environmental Record Centres Wales, which helps us to liaise with national partners and bid for national contracts like this one. I won't dwell on this slide because Sinead's given us such a great little introduction to each of the 7 species. Just to say that for shorthand during the purposes of this presentation and the accompanying report, we've referred to the 7 priority and threatened species as the focal species, because they're the species on which we focused all of our efforts. So as Sinead mentioned, data collation was actually a massive part of this project, although I won't be spending very long talking about it today. Prior to the start of the project, we pooled together existing data held by the local environmental record centres in Wales and by Bumblebee Conservation Trust, and we assessed that data and looked for potential additional sources, looked at the age of the data and where we'd had a lot of records from before, and we came up with a list of key recorders and other data sources who were contacted. It was done on a very short time scale, only a 2 or 3 week window really to get the bulk of this data in. So thank you to any participants who are here today who moved quickly to supply us with records. Most of the data we held before ended in 2019, so it's really important that we managed to get some 2020 records in, although of course 2020 was a very disrupted year for wildlife recording due to travel restrictions. We also double checked really that we'd picked up any additional data from the National Biodiversity Network Atlas, which is something we do regularly anyway. A few records came from that source. And then we got in touch with the Bees, Wasps and Ants recording scheme, who supplied us with a large data set of all of their records for Wales on these 7 species. We didn't have time to do a full coincidence or analysis look for duplicates with the existing records held by Look Wales. So in the next graph, the pie chart I show you, that there is overlap between some of the slices. Just a quick note on verification. Processes always take place for verification, but they can be quite slow. And so we really accelerated the process on any records that we had before, which weren't verified, but also all the records which came through from the diverse sources, including from specialists to individual recorders. We did a social media push to try and get records as well. So everything needed to be checked, and we're very thankful to the iRecord verifiers, particularly Matt Smith, and then Richard Comont from BBCT did a sterling job looking through over 1,000 records just to check the verification status. So following this collation, all the data was pulled together and presented in map form. But just before we go on to that, here's the pie chart I mentioned. So just under 2,500 records of these species were existing records within Look Wales on a Darin being our public-facing version of our shared database. We added in an additional 500 records to a Darin. And then this orange segment, which is obviously the largest, is the new data not on a Darin. BWAS, for various and completely understandable reasons, BWAS can't allow us just to directly import all of the data that they hold into the Look Wales database. As I say, there's probably a significant overlap between those 2 largest segments there, but we didn't have time to analyse that in great detail. But certainly BWAS is to be thanked for a huge contribution of data, and all those records are to be shared with Bumblebee Conservation Trust. So then we moved on to the mapping, which was probably the most exciting part of the project to some extent, to make sure we had up-to-date distribution maps for each of the 7 species. In each case, there was too much information to include on one individual map. So in each of the 7 species, I'm just going to quickly show you through the 3 maps we produced for each of the species. The left-hand map in each case, the largest one, is the up-to-date distribution map of all records. And so the record density, a higher record density, shows us darker colours up towards red, and yellow for the lowest density of records. But also within that, and why I've displayed it as large as I can on the screen, there are the 1 kilometre square concentrations of records too. What I should say is that all of these map outputs and all of the data that we generated from this project is being supplied to BBCT electronically, so that they can do full detailed analysis zoomed into whatever scale they need to be able to make full use of this data that we've collated. So yes, you can just about see the concentrations of the locations, and this is Bee, which Sinead started with. And as she mentioned, there's 3 strong populations in Wales, in Castlemartin area, South Pembrokeshire, the Kenfig area of Glamorgan Coast, and then the Gwent Levels being the largest extent of Bee. The middle map is an age structure. So what you'll notice from this, it tells a really important story, and that is that all of the outlying colonies in North and Mid Wales have not been seen since 1980, and a lot of them not seen since 2000. So the red dots are post 2000 records, the red squares, and the yellow squares are sites which are probably lost. And as we mentioned, the 3 known locations now shows these 3 clusters with the occasional outlying record. The final map shows the verification status. I won't dwell on this for any of the remaining 6 species, because in the most part, all records, or nearly all records, are verified as correct. There are just 1 or 2 which have not been checked. On to the next species. This is Bombus humulus, brown-banded Bee. Again, you'll see strong coastal in South Wales concentration, but with records in North Wales as well. The density of records is highest along the south coast, also Fleam Peninsula and Anglesey. But looking at the middle map, you'll see it's not such a picture of sort of retraction of range as in the case of shrill carder. So the yellow squares possibly lost or may just not have been checked for some time, but there's no indication that the bee has gone from its former range. Plenty to explore there. Moss carder, broadly a similar distribution, not so common in the borders, and very much more of a stronghold in the northwest parts of Wales, in Anglesey and the northwest coast. And a good scattering of sites when you can just about see the 1 kilometre square records. Good scattering of sites along the South Wales coast as well. Rudra areas, red-shanked carder, sparser records, nowhere with massively high density other than the Kenfig area. And as you'll see on the middle map, possibly some evidence of retracting range, or possibly not enough recent survey effort, but quite a few yellow squares dotted around even in South Wales. Ruderatus is the most scarcely recorded of the 7 species. In fact, the middle map tells a really important story, that it is only known it has only been seen in 2 locations since 2000, and so it's obviously a species which is seems to be on the brink in Wales, and so efforts required to work out its current status and make efforts for its conservation. Bilbrey bumblebee, Bombus monticular, sort of mentioned before by Sinead. It's the one which is quite different here. It prefers the uplands. Obviously, it needs bilberry and tends to hang around in upland, moorland and grassland areas. And so unsurprisingly, the distribution is much more inland, central and northern Wales, and less on the South Wales coastal strip. And possibly some slight retraction in range. It is a threatened species, but with some likely strongholds still in quite a few parts of Wales. And then broken belted bumblebee, Bombus sauroensis. Again, a fairly scattered picture. Nowhere with more than a handful of records. 8 to 15 records is the highest square in St David's, and as you'll see in the middle map, quite a few squares have not been, the records have not been seen for some time. Several of the squares on the left-hand map are representing older records. Right, so those are the individual distribution maps for the 7 species. We also thought it would be interesting to look for hotspots, and so we overlaid all records of all the 7 species and came up with this coincidence map. So quite a few of the species have coastal preferences, and several have the sort of South Wales coastal bias. So it's not surprising to see that the warmest colours are on in Pembrokeshire and the coast, the Glamorgan coast, with another hotspot here up in the Mid Wales coast. I think that's the Borth area, but some areas with no focal species whatsoever. So interesting, just as a very sort of crude hotspot analysis. The next thing we did, sorry, I mentioned, so now following all of this collation of data, we now have a complete picture of, as up to date as we can, picture of the known distribution of the focal species in Wales, and that will help us to make more informed decisions and to plan our projects in a better way, where we can take account of these 7 rare bumblebee species. The next thing we did, and this is a tiny bit complicated to explain, so bear with me, is we tried to get a measure of recording effort and see how that related to the distribution of the focal species. The red colours show the locations of, the orange to red colours show the locations of squares with the focal species. And the blue colours, the blue colour range, are locations where there are no focal species recorded. But the colour gradation relates to the number of bumblebee species present. So in an area where the colour is dark blue, there are a high number of bumblebee species recorded, but not including the target species. So if we have at least one target species, then the colour changes into the yellow to red range. As I say, a little complicated. And then there's another layer of complication. The number over the top is the number of records of Bombus species for that particular 10 kilometre square. And so that's used as a proxy measure of recording effort intensity in the each 10 kilometre square. And this varies wildly from over 1,600 records in the 10k square, where the Great Orme is located, and over 1,200 in several other squares, down to zero. We have 10 kilometre squares around in mid Wales where there are 0 records, and quite a few with 1 or 2. Just in case anyone's holidaying in the Llaneltid Wales area this summer, or indeed lives and works there, please go out and help us to fill our gaps in distribution of the Bombus species in that area. Right, I'm now going to hand over to Yusuf. I'm staying in control of the clicker, but Yusuf Smurry from West Wales is going to take you through the next selection of slides.
Hi everyone, I'm GIS Officer for WWBIC, West Wales Biodiversity Information Centre. Our goal for this analysis was to find what are the key habitats for each species. So we used the terrestrial phase 1 survey of whales as habitat data, which is the best freely available source of habitat data for whales at the moment. It is 20 years since the survey finished now, but it has complete coverage of all of Wales. For each habitat class in there, we computed the number of each bee species occupied grid squares for which that was the most common habitat. And the majority of our grid squares were at 100-metre resolution or finer. We excluded the records from before 1980 or those at a large, of course, 10-kilometre scale. Next slide, please, Anna. And it's easy to use this table to talk you through what we did from that. So this is the results of this frequency analysis for Bombus humulus. So you can see, for example, the first one here is improved grassland occupies is the most common habitat for 262 of the grid squares in which this species was recorded. This column expresses that as a percent of the total of that species occupied squares. This column has the percentage of whales that habitat class makes up. And this last column is quite important here. This is an association value that we derived for each species by dividing the percentage of occupied grid squares that habitat forms by its area, its percent cover in Wales. So if a habitat has no positive or negative association with a particular bumblebee species, we would expect it to contribute records roughly in proportion to its percent cover in Wales. So these two columns therefore should be roughly equal, and this should be similar to 1. And if it's far below 1, like it is in the case of improved grassland, that would indicate a negative association with finding a lot less records associated with that habitat we would expect from the area of the habitat. And if it's much above 1, that suggests that habitat is producing occupied grid squares records for the species disproportionately to its small area. So it suggests a positive association. So we can see very high association values for things like open dune, dune grassland on the coast. And we we then did some filtering steps just to refine our results, because we didn't want to include habitats which are contributing a large share of their occupied grid squares simply because they cover a large area. So we filtered all of these habitats to select those which have an association value of 1.5 or greater. And we also excluded habitats for which there were less than 5 occupied grid squares in which they were the most common, because they were too rare to really draw conclusions from. So next slide, please, Anna. Here's the results for Bombus humulus plotted for each habitat, plotted by the percent of occupied grid squares which it's contributing. So we have percentage on the y-axis here, and the orange bar shows the percentage of this species occupied grid squares for which each habitat was the most common in that grid square. And the blue bar is the percentage of that habitat cover in Wales. And you know, the dune habitats and the coastal habitats are coming out very strong. Buildings is coming out quite strongly here. It's the 3rd most common habitat class by percentage of occupied grid squares. We suspect that has a lot to do with the phase 1 classification, in that particularly in urban areas, gardens are often grouped together as a class called buildings. So that could largely be driving that. So this is one way of grouping the results by their percentage of occupied grid squares. And next slide, please, Adam. And another way is to group them by their association value. So here they're grouped by the height of the orange bar relative to the blue bar, or by the contribution to the species occupied grid squares relative to their area. And here we can see buildings is no longer in the top 10. Semi-improved neutral grassland, which was in the top 5, has dropped back quite a bit. And the top 5 habitats for this species by association are all coastal habitats here. And this is the case for Bombus humulus, was actually also the case for all of the species except for Bilbrey bumblebee, that the coastal habitats, and particularly the dune habitats, dune slats, came out on top in terms of the percentage of grid squares they were contributing relative to their area. And so in the report, we will, they're both of these, the graphs are both produced in this, presented in this way, so people can look at these and interpret them accordingly. So these numbers on the top, I'll just mention, give the total number of occupied grid squares of this species for which this was the most common habitat. And these are largely, showing what we would expect for most of the species. For coastal habitats are coming out very strongly, and spoil tips, bare ground, things like salt marsh are also coming out quite highly in terms of association. And for Bilbrey bumblebee, it's a picture of more dry acid heath coming out particularly strongly, and upland habitats. And this is a starting point then that allows us to map these habitats and see where to focus recording. Okay, next slide, please, Alan. The next question we wanted to know was how much of each species' known range is protected. So we created a flight range for each species by applying a 1 kilometre buffer to their records and resolving that to one area. We already have layers of all the non-statutory and non-statutory designated sites across Wales. So we then computed the overlap between each species' expected flight range and statutory or non-statutory designated areas. Next slide, please. So these are the results for the 7 species. So we can see that for most of them, the percentage of their, about 20 to 30% of their flight range is under statutory designated protection for most species. So these are special protection areas, SSSIs, or special areas of conservation. And then an extra chunk being made up of non-statutory designations, such as sites of importance for nature conservation, sinks, and local wildlife sites, ranging up to about as high as 50% for 2 of the species. And a key output from this will be that, these GIS layers will all be provided to Bumblebee Conservation Trust, so we can see where the hotspots of species records, whether or not that coincides with protected areas or not. So it could be a lever for which to try and get more sinks or etc. designated. Next slide, please. And the next question was, who are the key stakeholders for the species in terms of land ownership? So using the same 1 kilometer flight range as for the designated site analysis, we approached key organizations to see if we get digitized land ownership boundaries from them, and downloaded some publicly available data, such as the Welsh Government Forest Estate. We weren't able to proactively identify, different landholders for the particular locations where those focal species had been recorded, and we are still awaiting data from some of the organizations that we have contacted. But we have managed to get a decent picture in terms of people from conservation sectors and large landowners, and we have computed the overlap between land owned by different stakeholders and each species flight range. So I'll show that now. And these are the results for that. So we can see Ministry of Defence are coming out strongly as owning a lot of land intersecting with some of the species flight range. And no one landowner is owning more than about 5% of the land. National Trust is the only organisation to own a reasonable chunk, about 5% of each of the key species. Woodland Trust and Wildlife Trust on the bottom here. Woodland Trust showing just little slivers of land ownership, and Wildlife Trust showing a reasonably high percent for their small area of land coverage, as are the RSPB. So an outcome from this will be, this will provide an opportunity for landowners can then from here find out which sites are important for which species, and we can quickly repeat this as we get more data in and provide conservation bodies with the information to see who they should be contacting to get involved with land management to try and make the biggest impact in conserving these rare species. Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, Yusuf. Right, that's back to me again. And so what we wanted to do once we'd done this really interesting habitat association analysis was to put that on a map and to work out where the priority areas might be, both for future survey. And so future survey should be concentrated on those areas where the habitats that are strongly associated with each species are present, but where the focal species have not been recorded. So I'm going to give you some examples of that in a second, where we might go prioritize looking for these rare species. But also we're after priority areas for conservation action, and so those areas will be the existing known ranges, plus of course any other future areas prioritized for survey, especially if they do yield additional records. So taking the habitat association analysis, which Yusuf first showed you then, we identified what we called core and supporting habitats. Core habitats are those where there's the strongest association with each species, and so they usually have an association score of greater than 10, and they're shown in red on the subsequent maps that I'm going to show you. And then the supporting habitats have a less strong, but are still a significant association, and so their score was between 1.5 and 10. and those supporting habitats are shown in yellow on subsequent maps. We did move those boundaries slightly to tell the correct story that we needed to tell, as in if something fell just below one of the thresholds, we adjusted the mapping ever so slightly for individual species to make sure the key habitats were showing through. I'm going to use an example here again of Bombus humulus. Now this is a map which doesn't lend itself well to squashing onto a small report or a small screen. This is definitely one which we expect Bumblebee Conservation Trust to open up on their GIS and zoom in and move around. But I'll show you the sort of Wales-wide view for each species. On this map then we have the grey 10 kilometre squares representing the post-2000 records, and I've just popped a little smaller map on the right there just to remind you of the time-banded distribution of Bombus humulus. So it's just the red squares, the most recent records, which are shown in grey on the main map on the left. It's proved very tricky to sort of choose the correct colours for overlaying this to make it clear to see, and apologies if it is a little tricky to pick the yellow habitats out, the supporting habitats out. But what you will see, just as a really basic analysis of this, is that there are plenty of areas within Wales where the habitat, which the core habitats exist, which may support this species. And so you can see immediately quite a lot of the coast of Anglesey, of the Gwynedd coast, Merionethshire coast, where there is suitable core habitat, but no recent records. And again, you can pick out individual squares in North Pembrokeshire here, the southern edge of the Brecon Beacons, and up in northwest Wales, northeast Wales, the Clwydyn Range, the estuary. There are plenty of little patches of red habitat, core habitat, which are outside the current known distribution of this species. So we think this map, when analysed at a finer scale, will hopefully help to steer the planning of future survey effort. Now I'm going to flash up the maps for the 6 of the 7 species. The one species, Rudra has only 2 post-2000 records, so it wasn't not statistically significant enough associations to be able to include in this. But in each case, and we've got Monticola here showing the upland distribution and how these core habitats are these are the dry heathland areas. And so whilst there is a good coverage of records and a good coincidence of records with the core habitats, there are also plenty of gaps around the edges where recent records don't exist, but where the core habitats appear to. And I'm going to, in the next section, we'll zoom in on part of North Wales here to have a little look closer at that. We're just glancing across at Muscorum here. There again, as we've seen for other species, there are patches of habitat lying outside the known current distribution of this species. The Peninsula seems to stand out there as a potential area. And again, Anglesey coast. On to the next 3. Much sparser for Ruderatus. Actually only mapped the core habitats on that one, but significant stories. And again, I'm going to zoom in on this area to show you an interpretation of the distribution of Ruderatus. Similar pictures with Sauroensis. Again, the suggestion might be that these areas of core habitat would be worth surveying for this particular species. And likewise, Shrillcarder. We are obviously, it's a well-studied species now. We're aware of the 3 hotspots existing population, but they have cropped up in slightly different areas, on the North Pembrokeshire coast and in the South Wales valleys. I think this was in the Ebbw Vale area. So it is going to be worth keeping an eye out and perhaps surveying for this species in other areas. And maybe it is still hanging on in Gower or in Pembrey or Pendine, but not been seen for a long time, but the habitat is still there. So I mentioned the Monticular example, looking at a zoomed in area of upland in the northern part of Wales. This is the area around Bala, 3 10-kilometre squares, which I've picked out heading across towards Corwen and Derbyshire. So yeah, the grey patches indicate the post 2000 10-kilometre square records. The actual records are shown as 1 kilometre squares. You can just see a few of the sort of turquoise squares poking through. And there is a turquoise square here, but that's a pre-2000 record. And so it's really just to show, when you look into a finer level of detail, that there are patches of appropriate looking habitat which would fill the gaps in distribution. So to my mind, this would be a good priority area to go looking for Monticular, particularly concentrating on the areas of core habitat, the dry heathland. And recorder effort overlain on that shows that 5, 9, 14 Bombus species recorded for those 3 empty 10-kilometre squares. And so there's been very little recorder effort. That's the score of 5 and 9 for Bombus species records on the Look Wales database is very low. And so it suggests to me there haven't been many active bumblebee surveyors heading up into that area to look for the species, and hopefully if they did, they would find Monticular and add to our knowledge of that and other species. Again, just fading back to remind you the area we're looking at. The other example so yes, the analysis can be repeated for each species. I haven't had time, obviously, in this presentation, and equally during the short length of the project, we haven't been able to focus in on too many areas to give detailed examples. But we hope that BBCT will be able to use this data analysis for each species and to go searching for areas to prioritise their survey. And the measures that we've overlaid just then of the recording effort will help to identify poorly recorded areas. As I mentioned earlier, if hundreds or even thousands of records exist for Bombus species, it suggests that the square has been well surveyed. And if the priority species are absent, that may well be a true indication of absence. But where the survey effort is very low, I don't think we can conclude at all that the priority species are not present. So the other example I was going to just briefly look at is Bombus ruderareus, and this is pretty much the whole of southwest Wales coast from South Pembrokeshire across to Gower. And again, this was just to highlight that amongst those squares which haven't got recent records, so the 4 grey squares are the only ones with post 2000 records, we have some extensive areas of suitable habitat. Here is Pendine and Pembrey and the dunes of the Gower coast. But again, using the survey effort numbers, you can see a couple of these 10k squares have obviously been well recorded for bumblebees, 529, 536 here on Castle Martin. Yet the squares that contain Pendine and the northern part of Pembrey show a lot less records of Bombus species. So by that, as a proxy, we're concluding that's a proxy of perhaps lower recording effort looking for the priority bumblebee species. Now I'm going to hand over to Brad for the final part of our analysis, which was the policy review.
Thank you, Adam. So as Adam said, one of our elements was to review the policy landscape and then utilize that to look at opportunities for partnership working in the future, as well as ways of looking at conservation work further on with some of those partners. As you can see from the list that we have on the screen, supportive legislation, policies, plans, initiatives exist at the national, regional, and local scales across Wales. And to be fair, Wales is very progressive with its environmental policy, particularly as it pertains to pollinators, green infrastructure, and nature recovery. And BBC is well placed because it's an active partner in many of these programs already. And the other interesting thing is that, very positively, is that there is also an increasing number of examples where policy is being put into practice, and it's not just a document that's sitting on a shelf. Now, this synopsis is by no means comprehensive, as you'll see from the list, but it does highlight the large number of successes that have resulted from sustained effort of pollinator awareness campaigns over the last number of years. Notably missing, obviously, is, for obvious reasons, is BBCT's own bee walks and Skills for Bees projects. And I should also note that the response rate that we had was very low regarding the inclusion of rare bumblebees and pollinators in local development plans, nature recovery action plans, green infrastructure plans, etc. Part of this was due to a very narrow response window that we had available to us, as Adam alluded to earlier. And equally, I should note that as we're focusing on greater awareness and practical action specifically for rare bumblebees, our focal species, there are only a handful of plans that made mention of rare bumblebees, and most of these were shrill carder bee, with one exception of a brown banded carder bee in one of the reports in a Section 6 report. And before I move on, I should also say thanks to Kathleen Carroll, Katrin Grimstead, and Sean McHugh for supplying very helpful information to help report on this. Next slide, please, Adam. So, one of the things that we often do when we look at new initiatives and stuff is quite often leave the old ones behind. But as I mentioned, there have been a number of different initiatives over the years that have been very successful and continue to go on and perhaps have been operating for a number of years already. And we don't want to lose sight of those, and we want to maintain the momentum of those. So as we look at future initiatives, we also want to make sure that we preserve the ones that have been very successful in the past. Maintaining initiatives such as Bee Friendly and encouraging local authorities like Monmouthshire to continue their efforts is in the best interest of BBCT and the rare bumblebees. This work heightens the profile of bumblebees whilst retaining stakeholder enthusiasm and public interest. Because ultimately we need the public support to generate the political will, which leads to the resource allocation for practical conservation and engagement. Next slide, please, Adam. So with respect to some of the work that is going on, I'll just go through some of these examples because I know we're short on time. But BBCT is already a partner as part of the pollinator task force and is well placed to review some of the work that goes on and feed into that process. The action plan for pollinators was reviewed in 2018 and updated. So there are a number of actions within that are very relevant and up to date, and some of that work is ongoing. Area statements, just having a review of those, there are plenty of opportunities as those evolve into the future for BBCT to feed into those. None of them mentioned rare bumblebees or bumblebees within the plans, and only one of them mentioned pollinators directly, whilst 4 of them did mention green infrastructure plans within them, but not of rare bumblebees or bumblebees directly. The Nature Networks project, we currently have funding and it's gone into the engagement phase over the next few months. This is an ideal time for BBCT to get involved in that. The diagram to the left kind of gives you an idea of the stages in the design stage. Essentially, this program, for those that aren't aware of it, is identifying priority ecological networks based on protected sites networks, trying to identify the gaps then in that system of networks, and then coming up with a costed plan for trying to fill those gaps into the future, and then a monitoring, reporting, and evaluation element to that as well. And again, BBCT has a good opportunity in the coming months to really feed into that. Equally, Natir and Beef has got funding for the future. And again, this program is about species recovery and community engagement and building skills. And with a particular focus on rare species. BBCT is an existing partner as part of this project, and will help deliver some of this for the benefit of rare bumblebees. There's a lot of work going on at the moment with local wildlife sites and sinks. And again, this is an opportunity for rare bumblebees to either be built into some of the criteria for sinks and or with local wildlife sites is a great engagement element to speak to them. So a lot of the work that we've done today and demonstrated for you in these mapping processes will help us actively focus on where to put some of that effort in the future and proactively go out and speak to landowners, not just the large landowners we were talking about, but some of the private landowners as well. Next slide, please. And as we speak, a lot of the local nature partnerships are engaging with their constituents to bring their nature recovery action plans up to speed. Some of them are already completed, but a number of them are evolving now. And again, BBCT has a great engagement element in which to talk to them about building bumblebees, particularly focal species, within those plans. We talked about some of the areas within Wales where there's low recording or no recording. So pollinator monitoring schemes at a national level would be very helpful to help fill some of those gaps. And equally, some of the local survey and monitoring elements would also really help with that. I mentioned Bee Friendly, but that certification program has been really successful and is working well across Wales. And there are other offshoots of that and similar processes like Monmouthshire's Nature Isn't Neat project, which would be a benefit to rare bumblebees as well. And ultimately, looking at some element of payment for ecosystem services might be beneficial in two elements. There's obviously the investment side of that to try and encourage folks and use this as an incentive to get landowners using positive management long into the future and at a landscape scale. But also it's an engagement element. Again, it gives you a way in to talk to people. You've got a bit of money or a way of working with them to get money on a large scale. More people are willing to sit down and talk to you at the table. And one of the things lastly that I'll just mention was that it would be good to have a central repository for a lot of the information. It was very difficult to find out what the status of local nature partnerships were with their NRAPs, where they were. Was there anything in there about pollinators in general, more specifically about bumblebees? What about local development plans, Section 6 reports? Some of that is available on the Wales Biodiversity Partnership website, which was very helpful. So that might be the best place to put that. And I would expect that the pollinator task force would be best placed as the central contact for that information in the future, so that it's easier to find and then use that information for future engagement with partners. That's it for me. It's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but thanks, Adam. I'll pass back to you.
Thanks, Brad. I'm just going to quickly tie up just to draw conclusions from what we've shown you today. So we've got this new and accurate Welsh baseline collated for the 7 focal bumblebee species, and we've been able to do some pretty innovative analysis with the data that we've collated, overlaying those records on habitats and coming up with this methodology on habitat association, looking at how these rare bumblebees are protected by the designated sites network. And especially for today, I think the stakeholder analysis, which we weren't able to go into great detail on in this presentation, but we do want the landowners who are present today, land managers and conservation organisations, to get involved in work to conserve and protect these rare bumblebees. So hopefully, if you saw your organisation on the bar chart, you'll know that you have a role to play in conservation of these rare species. And if you didn't see your organisation on the bar chart, then please get in touch and we'll add you in as another stripe on that bar chart. So we've identified priority areas already, or at least we've given a methodology and examples of how to identify priority areas, but we expect BBCT to take what we've provided and do a lot more analysis themselves to work out where all the potential survey areas are and conservation action areas. And of course, the policy review that Brad's just summarised, a huge amount of work went into that, and there are great opportunities for engagement immediately now and going forwards in the next few years because of the number of initiatives taking place in Wales, which we could tap into to raise the issue of rare bumblebees. So briefly looking ahead, and I know Sinead's going to also look ahead in the next slot, but we can use the knowledge we've gained to plan future actions, whether that's for the survey or conservation action. And we can increase engagement with the key landowners and stakeholders to encourage protection and conservation of rare bumblebees. can raise the profile of the bumblebees via the local and national initiatives, and we can ultimately strive to secure funding for projects which deliver on the ground for the focal species. So that concludes the Look Wales segment. I'm going to stop sharing and hand over to Sinead.
Okay, hi, thanks for that. Okay, so I'm just going to really quickly run through a few kind of next steps. Okay, so first thing is we're going to publish the Welsh Landscapes for Rare Bumblebees report. So hopefully that'll be by the end of July, and that'll be translated into Welsh as well. So, and just to run over some of the things that we've kind of got going on at the moment as well, and I know that Richard in the chat has highlighted that we currently have a project called Skills for Bees Cymru, which is being led by my colleague Claire Flynn, so she's working across Wales to deliver training for volunteers to survey and monitor bumblebees, and that'll be that's a 3-year project till December 2023, and she's also working with BugLife on their Neath Port Talbot Beelines project as well. So that will hopefully help us target this this survey work and help to collect more records on these rare bumblebee species, which is a really crucial next step. We've also got quite a small project called Calon Gwenyn, which is more about bumblebee friendly farming. So you can contact me about that, or my colleague Anna, who's our Conservation Officer for Wales, and we've got some resources there for bumblebee friendly farming. We're also doing more work on sort of policy and advocacy. So we've got a senior science and policy officer, and across the trust we contribute to sort of policy and advocacy work. And particularly, you know, one thing that's come up in the chat is about agri-environment schemes, and that's going to be really a crucial mechanism for delivering habitat for rare bumblebees. So also some more targeted work. So as I mentioned, we have the Shrill Carnaby Conservation Strategy, which and we have a Shrill Carnaby Species Recovery Manager, Bex Cartwright, who's in post to take that forward. And we're also doing some delivery for Shrill Carnaby in the levels, working with BugLife again. And that project comes to an end this December. But as Brad has mentioned, there's a project on the horizon called Natur am Byth, with Natural Resources Wales as the lead partner, but that's a big Pan-Wales partnership project, and I'm the lead contact for that. So please do get in contact if you want to know more about that. And just generally to kind of wrap up and talk about, and Adam has kind of covered some of this about what we hope this will do, and hope we can sort of take forward in the coming sort of months and years. First of all, this provides a really useful framework for the Trust to take forward bumblebee conservation work in Wales. And also this is, you know, we'd hope to do similar work elsewhere in England and Scotland. So this is really a useful framework for us across Wales, England and Scotland. And as I've said multiple times in my sort of intro, one of the things that is common across these species is an association with landscapes with extensive and connected flower-rich habitat. So Brad mentioned the nature networks scheme. That could be an important mechanism for managing protected sites and connecting up those areas. But we really need to be ambitious with kind of landscape scale conservation work to not only ensure that we don't lose these species from our landscapes, which is a kind of key risk, but also ensure that they are able to thrive. Wales is in a really good position to lead on that, not only nationally but globally. And I'm just going to wrap up by saying a big thank you to everyone for attending or listening, if you're listening on the recorded version. A big thank you also to all the recorders who've submitted records. They are completely invaluable for this work. And a very big thank you to Look Wales for the fantastic work that they've done on this project. And they've really done such an amazing, comprehensive job across the team and in a very short window. So I'm going to hand over to Amy Plowman, who's our Head of Conservation and Science, who's going to lead on the Q&A.
Hello everyone. We've had quite a lot of questions going on in the chat and in the Q&A, many of which Richard has answered as we've gone along. But I think it might be worth just having a little bit of further discussion about some of them. So there was quite a lot related to access to the data and whether other organisations could have access to the GIS layers and even some of the data. So I don't know who wants to talk about that. It looks like Adam has unmuted himself.
Just in case. Yeah, I mean, certainly the plan is to share the data fully with BBCT, and I think it's very much down to BBCT how much you want to share that data onwards. We'd certainly be happy to help involve more stakeholders. I know I did see there was a question about individual landowners. How can they find out whether they've got the bumblebees? And I think as a sort of sensible small extension to the work we've already done, we could happily help add the extra landowners into this analysis that we've already done. Yeah, there will be some licensing issues to sort out if we were going to be sharing data, and there are actually lots of different layers of data which are involved in the project outputs. We've got not just the species records, but lots of GIS mapped outputs on priority core habitats, etc. And so I think it's probably best if individuals, having seen this presentation, can ask the specific questions, probably directed at BBCT, and between us we can work out how best to handle any data sharing.
The report is going to be published as well, so that obviously that's not the data itself, but all of the maps will be available through the report.
Okay, there were quite a few questions around farming, Sinead. I don't know if you just want to go into that in a little bit more detail about what we may or may not be able to do with influencing the agri-environment schemes.
Yeah, I mean, the signs, the proposals look really promising, but the devil's in the detail a little bit with that, I think. So I think the key for these species, it's about targeting geographically and in terms of the habitat type, and the kind of management of those habitats and the kind of scale and the connectivity of those habitats. So I think we are quite supportive of the proposals so far, but we'd like to see targeting for these rare species to be able to connect up habitats and make sure they're the kind of right habitats and managed in the right way.
Okay, thank you. There was some quite a conversation about some of the data. Is there an issue with data bias because conservation bodies have more recording on their sites? Is the 1 kilometre buffer too big for some of the species? I don't know who would like to discuss those things.
Happily just sort of answer the recording. Of course, recording is biased massively, and that's what we've tried to illustrate that with our recording effort analysis in the report and in the presentation today. And it is very true that recorders do tend to flock towards known sites to go and see the species that they're wanting to find, heading towards the honeypot sites for their target species. And there is huge potential for surveying outside the honeypot sites and getting access to private land, or perhaps land that hasn't been surveyed before. Just this week, for a different project, we ran a field recording day at a farm just outside the Gwent levels and found Bombus silvarum, and it's a new 1 kilometre square record. It's 2 or 3 kilometres from the nearest records on the levels, but it was a pretty standard farm really, and I'm pretty sure if you got out onto lots of other similar bits of land like that around the known sites, you could well start finding expansion of the known range of these species. I hope it's part of the sort of plan for taking the project forward to encourage survey beyond the best sites and the known sites, because that's when we'll fill in the gaps in our knowledge. Also, somebody, I think Oliver in the chat I noticed, asked for if it would be possible to put a map of was it areas of low recording effort. And I think that would be the more I've thought about this, and obviously I've been embroiled in all aspects of this project for the last couple of months, but I think it would be possible to look at those areas where recording effort is low and match them up to the core habitats for each of the species and work out which, and we could go on a sort of 10 kilometre square by 10 kilometre square basis, making suggestions for good places to go looking for rare bumblebees where recording effort has been low in the past. And obviously it's great. It would be great encouragement for the surveyors if they were pointed towards an area where the habitat looked good and the suggestion for which your target species should be for that particular walk or survey, and to be able to add new species to the Welsh distribution would be, new records to the distribution would be brilliant. So
that'd be
again,
great.
yeah, I think it's just a natural sort of progression of interpretation of the data that we've provided. So yeah, happily help with that.
Richard's just put his video on. Did you want to say something to that one, Richard?
Yeah, just going to add, that's very much one of the aims of this project and how it's going to link with Skills for Bees, so that we can prioritise those areas where we need to do the surveying, ultimately.
Do you want to do a quick plug for Skills for Bees? Because there was a question about how people can get training in BID.
Yeah, so Skills for Bees Wales is a 3-year project, as Sinead mentioned, the aim of which is to get people out surveying bumblebees, able to identify them across Wales. These are the 7 species that we're particularly interested in, but any bumblebee records are always useful. Claire is very, very active doing training virtually and in person, field events and that kind of thing. Please do have a look at our website and get in contact with her if you'd like to be involved, because the more the merrier.
And also related to that, Adam, there was a question about contact cards for the public so that people can report records to you.
Yes, I think somebody. Yes, I did quickly read that. We did produce some postcards for circulation promoting both the Lurk Wales app for data entry, and the Lurk Wales app is well, I think everyone's happy for me to promote that as one of the appropriate means of data entry. All the data flows into the iRecord system, so it's well worth using. And the other postcard, which I think was being referred to as the just to promote Aderin, which is a public-facing website of Lurk Wales, which you can look up the national distribution of any species, and if it's a non-sensitive species, as all of these bumblebees are classified as non-sensitive by NRW, so you can click on an individual 10 kilometre square, pull up, and that pulls up a 1 kilometre square grid map for that particular area. So if you are working in a particular patch of Wales where you think these bees may be present, check the status, local status of knowledge of those bees by using the publicly accessible parts of Aderin, and yeah, I think that will help you to work out where to target to try and put at least a new 1 kilometre square dot on the map. And the actual cards, yes, if that person can't remember who it was, just drop me an email at Subrec and we'll post some out to you.
Okay, I think we've been through most of the questions on the chat. There was one about are these species possibly going to benefit from climate change because they might be at the northern edge of their range, and Richard's answered it in the Q&A, but you might answer it for everybody just in case they've not been following that.
All of the species that we're looking at today either are now or have been previously found quite a lot further north in Britain. So it's not that climate is the only thing holding them back. It's probably a combination of climate and habitat, but they aren't going to go where the habitat isn't ultimately.
Okay. And then there were a few questions about how to get advice on land management, whether it's gardens, other types of habitats. Sinead, do you just want to do a plug for our resources and how to get them, how to find them?
Yeah, so we've got quite a lot of resources on land management advice and on gardening on our website, which is bumblebeeconservation.org. So in terms of gardening, we have the Be Kind tool, which can help you rate your garden for bee friendliness, and will give you sort of tips on what else you can plant in your garden to make it more bumblebee friendly. We also have a campaign at the moment called Be the Change, which is kind of a micro actions campaign, and it's got lots of gardening advice as part of that, and as I say, lots of other stuff on our website. In terms of land management advice, we have land management sort of advice pages on our website. I've mentioned that we have a kind of farming project, so we called Calon Gwenyn, which has some kind of farming for pollinators resources associated with that, and we have some species specific resources as well, so in terms of land management for particular rare species. So hope that covers it.
I think so. Basically, just look at our website, and if you can't find what you're looking for, email us. I'm just trying to skim through all the other questions. I think we've mostly done them. There was a bit of discussion about species-rich arable plant assemblages, and are they associated with the bee species, or is that just a sort of correlation because they happen to be coastal as well? Anybody want to have a go at that discussion? No one's volunteering.
I'm not sure. Yeah, that's a. I don't know. In terms of the kind of mapping and the data, I'm not sure. I think there's definitely opportunities there with kind of arable management, and I'm sure there's, you know, if you think about a lot of these bumblebee species I've mentioned, they use a range of habitats, and they actually use quite a broad range of forage plant species to forage on as well. So so there's definitely potential there, but I'm not sure about the kind of detail.
I think well, to start with, we've not presented the full set of bar charts yet. Even in the first draft report, we haven't pasted all the bar charts in. I don't think arable is going to feature, because arable in general is a extensive, quite large scale habitat, albeit Wales isn't massively arable. I don't think there will be strong habitat associations. Yusuf, I suspect, is probably good. Yusuf's got some facts at his fingertips to rescue. But I think one of the problems is that there's a huge range of arable, from the heavily pesticide sprayed intensive crops down to the species rich arable, which the likes of Plant Life and others will be trying to seek out. And it would be great if they were actually plotted as different habitats within the phase one, but unfortunately they're not, and so it'd be quite hard to pick them out, I think. Yes, Yusuf, carry on, rescue me.
Wasn't it the only species for which arable came out with a strong association after filtering was Bombus sylvarum? I could quickly share screen and show that chart if anyone was interested.
Yes. Yep, we've got time.
So if people can see that.
Yeah.
So this is Bombus sylvarum organised by share of occupied grid squares, and arable is quite high in terms of the absolute number of records for which that grid squares, for which is the most common habitat. And if we sort that by association, by the contribution relative to its area, it's not as high, but it's still in the top 10. And this was a species for which there were a reasonable amount of grid squares occupied. So this is the top 10 out of something like 30 odd habitats. So how people choose to interpret that, I don't know, but it's the only one for which arable came up quite strongly. It's also the only one which wasn't significantly negatively associated with improved grassland. It was improved grassland was contributing grid squares roughly as you'd expect for its area for this species.
I'm guessing a lot of the association or sylvarum with arable and improved grassland is because of the nature of the the Gwent levels where its hotspot is, where there's quite a lot of intensively farmed agriculture in amongst the ditches and the reens and it's the field margins and the reen edges where the interest really lies, isn't it?
Maybe Pembrokeshire as well. I suppose it also depends. I'm not quite sure what the definition is of arable in this particular context, because I suppose even sort of dairy farming systems could be classified as arable if they're depending on what their system is. So I suppose maybe it depends on.
Would have just been land cover. So this would have been an arable and sown fields with crops. There's no thought was given to particular land use when the survey was done. It was really just people looking at fields. So if the dairy farm, had a lot of improved grassland for grazing, it would have gone down as improved grassland. The arable will be sown crop fields.
Yeah.
And there's a comment now that there are high bee numbers on organic arable that Glenda has noticed, which I guess the habitat's not at all detailed enough to tell us whether it's organic or not. So that could make a big difference.
Make a nice future project.
Important, I guess, to note for this, even for this species, though, the top 3 are still the coastal dune habitats. So arable is featuring, but still much more likely to be found in those very flower-rich dune habitats.
Okay, I think we've dealt with any questions. If anyone has a desperate question that they want to ask, just get it in the Q&A or the chat as quickly as you can. We've only got about 3 minutes of our official time left, but it's been quite nice to have that discussion and those questions. Really nice to see the comments about people's enthusiasm for the project and for where it can take us now. If it gets us more records, more people going out into those under-recorded areas, that'd be brilliant. If it gets us some more landowners who are interested in finding out what bees they've got and maybe getting involved in a project that we're running at the moment or one that we might have in future, that's also brilliant. So thank you very much. Thank you to all the lurks for all the work you've put into it. It's been quite a fun project. Really nice to see the maps. I'm a big fan of maps. I always like having a good look at those. I don't know, Sinead, do we need to say anything else, or
no? I think
are we finished or within good time? Perfect time. Yeah.
And the only other thing is that this is being recorded and we'll put it on our YouTube channel and I think probably circulate it to all the attendees.
Okay.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thanks
Good list of people
for coming. Thanks for everyone for entering their discussions and their thoughts. That's been really interesting to see those. And hopefully you'll get a message or a notification or something when the full report's actually available. But it'll be on our website, I'm sure, anyway. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Bye.